In this podcast, Dan Jelski, author of Your Future Jobs, talks about building a career in the new normal. So stay tuned. Welcome everyone to Jobs of Future podcast. Today we have with us Dan Jelski, who is an author of an interesting book on your future job, building a career in the new normal. Thanks, Dan. And he was a professor of chemistry, surprisingly, at SUNY New Paltz in New York State. For several years, he served as Dean of School of Science and Engineering at New Paltz. Prior to that, he was chemistry department head at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, an engineering school in Indiana. He began his academic career at SUNY Fredonia, located in Snow Country near Buffalo, New York. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from University of Chicago, completed his doctoral of philosophy in chemistry at Northern Illinois University. In addition to his faculty appointments, Dan has held research appointments at University of Buffalo, Emory University, and the Institute of Science at Budapest, Hungary, among other places. Dan is married and has two children. He received a Fulbright scholarship in 1996 that enabled him and his family to spend a year living in Kampala, Uganda. There he taught chemistry at Makerere University. He enjoys traveling, writing, and reading about economics and politics. With that, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
Beautiful. So before we get to the exciting, meaty stuff of learning more about your book, let's understand what brought you that book. So if you can walk us through your journey, that would be amazing.
Well, I started out my academic career as a chemist and teaching chemistry. And when I started teaching back maybe in the 1980s and certainly into the 1990s, I thought I was teaching a very useful subject. There were jobs for my students, and the general chemistry course that I taught was useful skills, and students would come back and say, wow, I really needed to know the material that I learned in general chemistry. And this was at Fredonia, and the industry around there was in food processing. And I set up, I was basically in charge, or maybe I initiated the program of student internships working with these food processing companies in quality control. And I got a lot of students jobs doing quality control for these food processing companies, checking the quality of peanut butter and jams and juices and all kinds of things like that. And I learned an awful lot about food processing. That was kind of fun, actually. And then I compare that to today, and I'm not at Fredonia anymore. But I talked to my old colleagues, and that whole industry has just completely changed. And the jobs that used to exist for my students have now been completely automated out of existence. And I don't know what chemistry majors do. And then, now that we have tools like, I'm too old, I don't even know how to use them myself right now very well, like Mathematica, for example, which can basically do everything except kiss your wife for you. And so the skills that I teach in general chemistry just don't seem to me to be all that relevant anymore. Nobody is going to balance chemical reactions by hand, or do stoichiometry by hand, or solve limiting reagent problems by hand. And yeah, maybe it's important to know how to do that in principle, but it's not really a practical skill in the way that it used to be. And so the world has changed. And then I see that with biology majors. I mean, everybody thinks that biochemistry and biotechnology is a way to go, and they are important industries. But an awful lot of my students who were, in fact, biochemistry or biology majors recently have wound up being unemployed. And I had some, perfectly good students. They weren't A students, but they were B students. And they'd graduate, and they couldn't find a job in their field. And they'd end up going back to school to get a nursing degree, for which they didn't need the biology degree at all. And I kind of wasted 4 years of their life getting this biology degree. And maybe it's fun, and maybe you know a lot about genetics, and maybe you know a lot about bacteria or whatever. I don't know. But it's not really, time well spent. So it just seems to me that the world is changing a lot, and I kind of feel sorry for these people. And I look out on these sea of freshmen, and I wonder, why are they doing this? And it worked back in the old days, and will certainly work for some of them even today. But for a large number of people, that kind of traditional college education just doesn't really make that much sense anymore. And so I wrote my book about addressed mainly to average students. So the folks who graduate with an engineering degree from Stanford, they don't need to read my book. They're going to be successful no matter what. So and the folks who are never even thinking about going to college anyway, they probably won't benefit too much from my book. But there is a large group of people in between who are certainly capable of going to college. And I'm just wondering, is that really the right choice for them? Is that something they should do? And if they do go to college, how can they prepare to have a successful career in a very rapidly changing world? Something that the world's just not going to look the same in the future as it does today.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that, by the way. So, where do you spend time nowadays?
Well, right now I'm retired. So I spend time at home and I read a lot. And my wife and I, we're going to do some traveling. I got a grandson now. So yeah, that's what I do with my time. I enjoy myself. I mow the grass. So that's basically what I'm doing right now.
Interesting. And so if you look back in your journey as a professor teaching kids and then responsible for preparing the workforce of tomorrow, how has over your sort of span as an academic, how have you seen the learning landscape changed?
Well, the learning landscape has changed. You mean in terms of how we teach the classes? That has changed actually remarkably little. And colleges are very conservative places. They don't like change and they resist it, and it's kind of a guild. So it has changed some. So the adult education part of colleges, that has moved pretty much completely online. And colleges that now, they don't teach adult education anymore. That part has moved pretty much entirely online. But for my college, which was, it's a state comprehensive college. It's not one of the elite institutions, but it's not a little community college either. It's that range in the middle. And our students are overwhelmingly your traditional college students, 18 to 22 years old. They're in the top 40% of their high school graduating class, or maybe even in the top 30% of their graduating high school class. They're not in the elite. They're not students that can get into Harvard or Yale or people like that. For them, it hasn't changed very much. They might take one or two online classes at some point. But it's still chalk talk. It's a bunch of professors standing in front of a chalkboard. And maybe we use PowerPoint now instead of the chalkboard. And the homework assignments are now graded online in chemistry classes for the most part. So that's less work for us, and it's probably better for the students. But these are all very minor incremental changes. If you compare college today with college 30 years ago, the main difference is we just cost 2 or 3 times more money. But other than that, not very much has changed. It's all very similar to the way it used to be. And that certainly is part of the problem. It seems to me it needs to change more, not just in terms of the way that the education is delivered, but in what the purpose of the education is and what it is we teach.
Beautiful. So now if we see your perception, or at least the students' perception of getting taught throughout these courses and throughout sort of your journey, how has student expectations changed? Like, have you seen what they expect out of the course and what they and then get out of this? That changed? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
That's a little hard for me to answer. I don't think student expectations are, well, maybe they're beginning to change now. But students go to college for 2 reasons. One reason is to find a job, and that's a really important reason for a lot of students. And the other reason is for all the other things that you get to do in college. You get to go out with the opposite sex, you get to have a social life, you get to play sports, you get to live on your own for the first time in your life, you get to grow up. And so the second group of reasons are exactly the same as they were all since forever. So, these are people who are 18 to 22 years old, and they're interested in all those sorts of social skills, I guess is what you'd call it, and opportunities. And that's really important. So the non-academic side of college, I think, is probably become more important to them than the academic side of college. And the academic side of college is becoming less and less relevant, and it becomes harder for students to see directly how getting a degree is going to help them build a career.
Interesting.
I think that's become harder for students to see.
Interesting. And as an educator, what are your thoughts on the online education? So giving them all this sort of content through online mediums.
So I have to confess, I'm a college professor, which means I've never taught an online class in my life. And that's pathetic, isn't it? I mean, that really is sad. But a few of my colleagues teach online classes, and my institution has gone kicking and screaming into the online world. They've had to do it now, but it's all done very reluctantly. And there's no enthusiasm for it. And even up until I retired, it was basically not possible to teach an online class during the academic year. It could only be done during the summer, which was sort of an optional period. In other words, we didn't want to compete with our in-person classes. So the professors kind of guard their prerogative to teach classes in person. So you ask me, what is it like to teach online? And I will have to tell you, I have no idea. I don't really know. But I think it is very good for some students. And I can refer to my son's example. He's basically completely self-taught online, and he does very well. So if you're self-motivated and if you're self-disciplined, you can do extremely well with the online classes. Can the average college students get by with online classes and has that degree of I'm talking now about 18-year-olds, have that degree of self-discipline and self-motivation? I'm not so sure, and the evidence seems to suggest that they're not as successful in online classes as they are in something with a little bit more personal guidance. The other thing you don't get from online classes, you get none of the social life that you get with a person-to-person college. And that is a big attraction of a college. That's why I think colleges will probably not disappear.
Interesting. And so beautiful. And by the way, thank you so much for walking us through that. So now let's get on this book, Your Future Job. So tell us what brought you to this idea of writing a book?
Well, probably not one single event, but I would say looking out at a bunch of young kids, and rather than being happy for them and enthusiastic about them starting their time in college, I found myself feeling sorry for them and wondering what was going to happen. I wanted to do something about that. By the way, I need to give a shout out to my co-author. His name's Tom George. He's chancellor, that's CEO of the University of Missouri at St. Louis. And I'm the lead author of the book. The book is mainly my ideas and my content, but he really helped out a lot with some of the writing and with some of the examples. So I definitely want to give him and I need to make sure I share the credit with him as well. So yeah, I've lost my train of thought now. What was the question again?
No, it was good. So so now let's talk about your journey through writing this book. Like, so once you got this, okay, let's get on this writing these books.
So I started feeling sorry for my students, and then I started reading and listening to people who are skeptical about higher education. And I think Brian Kaplan is a name that comes immediately to mind. It became clear to me that going to college is not necessarily the right thing for people to be doing. And I'm not saying you shouldn't go to college. I'm saying it's something one needs to think about carefully before one just sort of automatically goes to college. And if you do go to college, you need to make sure that you're keeping yourself grounded, that you have some idea of what your career goals are, and that you take responsibility for your own progress, and not just leave it up to the professors to tell you how you're going to get a job, because they honestly probably don't know very much.
Interesting. And when you're writing a book on your future job, so now you are a chemistry professor, and then you said, okay, let me try and investigate and see how sort of folks could keep their job. What are some of the research, and sort of where did you find the insights that you could share in this book?
So I would say that beginning maybe 10 years ago, I became really, really interested in economics. And especially more recently, I've gone through and read a lot of basic textbooks, first of all, just to get myself up to speed there. And then I've been reading, a lot of blogs and things as much as I can get my hand on about economics, and I've been interested in how that kind of fits together. So I would say the accumulation of all that reading, plus my experience with my own students, that's kind of been the source of information for where I got this book.
And so now in that book, so what is the underlaid theme that this book represents? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
The underlying theme is to, first of all, understand what a job really is, and what you have to do to be successful in a job. And then second, to understand how technology changes things. And I can't predict the future any better than anybody else. I have no perfect 100% vision about what technology is going to do, but I can make some loose predictions about what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. And I try to explain those. And then I tried to give some students some financial advice. So there's a whole chapter in the book about capital, and about saving money, and about saving for retirement, and about staying out of debt. And you'd be surprised how little students understand about that. They don't teach that in high school. They don't teach it in college. They know nothing about money. And I think that's really important for students to understand, especially high school students. So I try to put that in there. I've tried to aim the book to my audience, my intended audience. I won't say the audience of the people who've actually bought it, but my intended audience would be a rising high school senior. That is somebody who's just finishing their junior year in high school, and they are at the position where they need to start thinking about college. And this would be the book for them and their parents. So my intention was to write for that particular people. Now, of course, the audience grows. It could be for college freshmen or college juniors. It's not for mid-career career changers. It's not for adults. It wouldn't work for them.
Interesting. And I think the book has a very clever title, by the way. So kudos to you on that. So it has future, it has job, it has career, and it has normal. I think those are very potent field that is impacting all of our lives today and probably tomorrow. So how do you define each of them? So how do you define the future, job, career, and normal? If you can shed some light on that.
So my idea of a job is when you are doing something for other people. So if I work in a restaurant and I cook food for you, I'm cooking your food and you're paying me in return for doing that. So it's basically a trade. I cook food for you and you give me some money that I can then use to buy airplane tickets or computers or a whole bunch of other things that I can then buy from other people. So ultimately a job is something that you do for other people. It is ultimately about the consumer. Now, we get very specialized in our lives. So people are then several steps removed from the consumer. So you've got this whole supply chain. So it's not just a cook in the restaurant. It's a guy who runs the wholesale food store where restaurants buy food from, or maybe the fish market. It's a organic farmer up in the hills outside of town that grows the bespoke vegetables and organic products that they cook in the restaurant. It's the people who provide all the stoves and equipment and hardware that you need to run a restaurant. It's the people who manufacture the tables and the chairs and the napkins and the silverware. And, if you extend it out, there are millions of people involved in the fried chicken dinner that I might serve you in the restaurant. And I think of these as being supply chains, and where you draw the line on these supply chains is, of course, completely arbitrary because it all merges into one big mess at some point. But it's very useful to think about that final consumer, wherever you are in that supply chain. Even if you're 2 or 3 steps removed from that final consumer, if you think about who is the person who's ultimately buying your product. When you understand that, then you understand a lot about how important it is what you do, how stable that market is going to be, to the degree to which you're going to have a career a long time in the future. So, the restaurant business is something that's stable. People are going to be eating at restaurants for a very long time. And for the most part, it's not going to be automated. It's going to be automated in some places. But the fine dining restaurant with a human chef and a real waitress, those are jobs that are here for good, and they may not be high paying, but they are real jobs with real consumers, and they're not going away anytime soon because consumers will always want that. And so I ask people to think about who the ultimate consumer is for their career. So if you're a data scientist, for example, as you are, well, who is going to be the person who buys data science? Consumers don't go and they don't pick up a pound of data science and take it home and cook it for dinner in the evening. So you're going to provide services to some company, and that company is going to probably provide services to some other company who is going to then serve the individual consumer. And it will help you in your career if you have some idea who that final consumer actually is, because then you'll sort of know what you're talking about and who your customer actually, who's going to be paying your bills, because it's that ultimate consumer that at the end of the day pays your bills.
Interesting. And I think you talked about that you are right now an amateur economist. You're reading a lot about the economy. So if you wear your economist hat, what is a normal that you can define?
Okay, so the normal was, the way I use the term normal in the book was the world before 2008. So in 2008, we had the Great Recession. And before that, the economy was growing at some very steady pace. Basically, there were some ups and downs, but basically it was growing at some very steady pace. And then all of a sudden it fell off a cliff. We had a big, deep recession. And that's not unusual. That would normally happen. And then normally you would have a recovery, which would be a very sharp recovery afterwards. And then you would go on this very steady pace after that, in the way it used to do. Well, that's not happened now. We did have that steep drop off, but we've not had the return to the rate of growth that we had before. In other words, the rate of growth after the Great Recession has been much slower than the rate of growth before the Great Recession. And there are a whole bunch of possible explanations for why that may be the case. Why has the growth rate slowed down since the Great Recession? But that, to me, that indicates that we really do live in a different kind of world, and the nature of employment is going to be different, and not necessarily worse, just different. And that's sort of what I mean by the new normal. And when I wrote the book, which was like 2014, I guess, we were still sort of barely recovering from the recession. People were having a hard time finding jobs. Today, of course, it's quite different. Today, of course, there's basically zero unemployment for all intents and purposes. So today, it's actually a somewhat different situation. But I would still stand by my the longer term prognosis that I have.
Interesting. And in this new normal, I think so. One thing that I find really interesting. So if I talk to any fellow economist about what they are seeing today. So everyone is scratching their head, right? So it's saying the indicators that used to define, and I think you have put it the best, that it's new normal. It's not really a normal. That as an economist you said, okay, if I see this, I should expect that, right? So that the entire matrix has changed. So in that, how do you, like, what are some of your suggestions on, or some of your insights on how should anyone looking to get employment into this new normal? What are some of the suggestions that you would give? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, I guess it's not so much what you. Well, okay. So there are some jobs which are likely just going to go away because of automation and because of people like you, data science, or you're going to automate a lot of jobs out of business. So one of those are mathematics. I mean, computers can do math better than you can. And I have no clue why we're still teaching kids teaching kids algebra. I don't understand that. Have you ever used algebra in your career? No, I mean, and then I used to teach, when I was at the end, I was teaching general education classes, and I would ask the students, how many of you have used long division since you were in school? And basically, one or two people would raise their hands. I mean, these are people who graduated from high school like 2 or 3 years ago, and they took long division back when you do long division, 4th or 5th grade, and they've never used it, right? So I can sort of understand why you need to do long division, but it's not a practical skill anymore. Nobody's going to sit there and do long division. And the number of people who actually need calculus in their careers is probably less than 1%. And the number of people who need algebra might be 1 or 2%. So computers could do math better than you can. Computers can do chemistry, stoichiometry better than you can. Those kinds of quantitative number crunching skills, what were typically called STEM careers or STEM skills, those jobs, they're not going away, but they're going to be a whole lot fewer of them. And an awful lot of those jobs can be computerized and automated. So the jobs that remain will be very high paying and have very high skilled people, but the average STEM, the lab tech or somebody like that, those jobs are, and I think in many cases actually have gone away and just simply don't exist anymore. They're not the kind of jobs for the average student anymore. So, I don't understand why we require so much math in college. Maybe there's some reasons for it. I think the emphasis on STEM training and STEM skills is a little bit misguided. The jobs of the future are more likely going to be in the arts and humanities, things that computers can't do. So, computers, maybe they can write some boring news article about a press release, but they can't write something that people really want to read. So, it's going to be a long time before they can do that. Computers can learn how to flip hamburgers, but a computer can't be a chef in a nice restaurant who uses senses of taste, touch, smell, sight, even hearing in some cases, I suppose. So, and puts it all together and knows what people like to eat and knows what tastes good and can mix things in the right, in the right combinations to make something that's really good and delicious to eat. So a computer is never going to be able to do that. So those jobs are completely safe, I think. Whereas the jobs that depend on mathematics and on doing things over and over again and or on computation of some sort, those jobs, it seems to me, are at risk, and those are all up and down the career spectrum. I mean, truck drivers are famously going to be automated out of existence. I would argue that a lot of medical doctors, at least a lot of what they do, is going to be automated out of existence. And I think a lot of what college professors do is going to be automated out of existence. There will always be college professors, but we're not going to be standing in front of a blackboard teaching students like we do now. That kind of thing, it seems to me, is gradually on its way out, very slowly.
Interesting. No, I think that's a very correctly said, by the way. So I think one thing that I can recall. So I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I was talking to one of her friends' parents who are. Her mom is, I think, one of the Montessori schools principal, and I think we were talking about how when we were kids, when we were young, uh, the education that we get and when we get employed, how much it is used. There's a fair amount of overlap. There's fair amount of usage that sort of we can expect that. But right now, the thing that we are using on the employ in our jobs daily, and as you rightly said, the mathematics, the basic algebra, it's nowhere to be found. Like so, and then right now, so and another interesting thing uh, one of the interesting child psychologists added to that was, hey, do you know what, we strive for efficiency, that hey, our kid should be best at what they do, but efficiency means automation. So he said the best itself means that she does whatever best she could. That means she get a secret recipe of success, and she just use that over and over, and that itself means an automatable art. So the way we even value education, or the way we sort of understand, and this is a success from education, needs to be revisited from what we are seeing nowadays. And I think so. What is your thought on that? That if, and I think you shared your concern about how universities haven't changed much, but the employability landscape has totally re-evolved now. So how if I'm grinding through this educational system and hoping to be employed, what are some of the things you could suggest to me?
Okay, well, I have two children, and they did alternate paths through this whole system. My son never went to college at all, and he joined the military instead. And he's not 30 years old. He's already earning 6 figures. So and he's got a retirement account. He's got zero debt, and so I mean he's a smash hit, and he's never set foot in a college classroom. So that's one model. My daughter, on the other hand, got a degree in English. And everybody says, well, wow, what an impractical degree. Why would you get a degree in English? Well, she works now as she's a very successful editor for a trade magazine in New York. It's a business-to-business magazine, and she earns a good living at it. Now, so there are two ways to deal with this. One is you have to have talent in something, and my daughter happens to be a good writer, and she has a sufficient talent. So my book, the best advice I give to students is be good at what you do. And whatever you do, if you're good enough at it, you're going to get a job. So if you're really good at basketball, you're going to be a professional NBA basketball player, and you're going to make millions, and you're going to do really well. But you have to be really, really good at basketball to do that. Other jobs are not that competitive. But my daughter is good enough at writing that she is competitive, and that she can get a job in the New York media market, which is reasonably, it's not like the NBA, but it's a reasonably competitive field. So for her, the English degree paid off. But somebody who doesn't have the talent in writing is not necessarily going to pay off that much. So you have to decide whether or not you have a sufficient talent to be good enough at what you do to get a job in what you do. And if you are good enough, then going to college in that discipline is a worthwhile thing. And if you're not good enough, then going to college, being the B student probably is just not good enough to get a job in that field. The A students can do pretty much anything they want. The B student is going to have to add some other talent or something else to it that gets them over the hurdle and gets them into onto the career path. So I think, well, the probably the most important advice I give to students is make sure you're good enough at what you do, that you are going to be able to compete and get jobs in that field, and you need to be really brutally honest with yourself, and decide and make some decisions about whether or not you're really good at what you do. If you take general chemistry and you end up with a B or a C, well, it might be time to start thinking about changing your major, because the A students in chemistry are the people who are going to get the good jobs in the chemistry field. So maybe some B students will get through, but the C students probably not.
So now, if I'm deciding whether I should go to college or not, what do you suggest?
Okay, so the most important thing about going to college is you have to graduate. And as Brian Kaplan has pointed out, an awful lot of college is about signaling. The employers are not really interested about what you learned in college. They just want to see if you can actually get through it and finish it. That means you have the IQ. That means you have the work ethic. That means you can deal with boredom. That means you can deal with bureaucracy. That means you likely are going to be able to deal with customers. So people who finish college have a stamp on their head saying certified they can do those things, independent of what they majored in. So from the employer standpoint, it's not so much what you major in, it's that you are able to finish it. If you don't finish college, then you've basically got a stamp on your head that says, no, you can't do those things. And so if you don't finish college, you have worse than wasted your time. You have basically put yourself in a category of people who are not reliable, or in some way are not able to get things done. And employers are not going to want to hire those people. So my son, at age 18, he would not have done well in college. He was not interested. He wouldn't have enjoyed it at all. He wouldn't have been good at it. And the best thing he ever did was not go to college. So he joined the military instead, which I thought also was a very good idea for him. And so now he is on his second job, which nominally says bachelor's degree required, even though he's never spent a single moment in a college classroom. If he had gone to college and flunked out, he would never have gotten those jobs. So that college degree required doesn't mean that they want the college degree. It just means they don't want people who flunked out of college. That's what they don't want. And my son, by never going to college at all, didn't flunk out of college. So he's free of that whole stigma. So I think if you go to college, you have to be pretty darn sure you're going to graduate. And 40% of college students don't graduate. So that means 40% of them are basically screwed. And so if you are skeptical about whether or not you're going to be able to graduate, then by all means don't go to college. So just do something else. Do something useful. Just get a job. I mean, joining the military is not that easy anymore. But just get a job and prove that you're a reliable, honest, trustworthy person, and you'll be on your way. Whereas if you go to college and flunk out, then you've wasted your time and you've wasted your money, and you have basically damaged your reputation by not finishing college. So I think the most important thing for students thinking about going to college is, realistically, are you going to be able to graduate? Do you like school? Can you put up with the, pardon my language, bullshit that is entailed in going to school for 4 years? And if you can, then by all means do it, because it will benefit you. But if you can't, then do something else.
Interesting. So what do you say about? I think so. If I recall my college days, once you get in, like, you have no clue what's going to be like, right? So many topics that were thrown at you, some you thought, hey, you may be amazing at that, but you were not. Then some of the things you were saying, hey, this is like so hard, but eventually you will just end up cracking that pretty open. So what about those serendipity that will happen after the fact, that maybe I'm not too much informed when I'm just deciding whether to go or not go, to decide? What do you suggest to that wandering mind?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, and I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, part of it, this is less of a problem now because the economy is so strong but that's, unfortunately, that's probably only a temporary situation. It's not going to last for a long time. But it's a really hard question. How do you know how good you're going to be at it before you try? And you don't, of course. So I would say, do you like school? That's the first thing. If you hated high school and you can't stand sitting in classes and stuff like that, well, that college is not for you. You might be really smart, and you might be able to learn things online or on your own or whatever. But sitting in a classroom and listening to somebody like me talk at you for 50 minutes 3 times a week, that just may not be work for you. So if you don't like school, don't go to college. And don't let anybody talk you into it. thinking, well, you have to go to college to get a job. That's not true. You don't have to go to college to get a job. So I think the first priority is to like school. And second, if you do go to college and you're not sure what you want to do, then you're right. You need to try a whole bunch of different classes and take a sociology class, take an art class, take a science class, take a math class, and see what you really like and see what you're really good at. And then you need to think about what are you going to do for your first job? What kind of skill are you going to acquire in addition to going to college that's going to put you on a career track for your first job? So in my daughter's case, it was writing, and she practiced her writing in college and did it very purposefully, trying to make sure that she was a good writer, and that got her first job. In my son's case, he is in IT and he got all these certifications, and then took advantage of all the advantages that the military had to offer to increase his experience level, and he then has turned that into a really good career. So. I see, some of my students are really successful and they do the same thing, but they do it by going to college as opposed to not going to college. And a lot of my students, I think, would probably be better off doing something other than going to college. They shouldn't be there.
I think that's a very interesting thought, because I remember whenever I'm asked this question from either folks from my family or folks from my friends' kids who are deciding to go and which college to pick and whatever, right? So I always have a difficulty in sort of negotiating with them, and my perception is this is the best paid sandbox you would ever get somehow. So as a data scientist, I know the landscape is changing really fast for jobs of future. It's machines are taking over our perception, and our emotional value jobs, which we consider very close to our heart, that defines employability, are changing. Our perception of job is changing. The definition of job itself is changing. When so much of things are turbulent, you need a safe ecosystem around you to empower you. And I think I wrote a blog a couple of years back which got a lot of heated response from both sides of the folks on both sides of the aisle. That I said was, hey, this is the best place to test and try your entrepreneurship skills. You have professors, you have teachers whose job is to research in the industry that probably you would be venturing and planning to see into. You have, as you rightly said, you have social sort of ecosystem around you to keep you sane when you're struggling through it. But I see your point that if you don't have a drive to go through all the pain and agony and sort of this learning and sort of this uphill battle to figure out how you can bake yourself into this future, then it would be a hard bet.
I guess I'm going to push back a little bit on the entrepreneurship. College is a very conservative place, and it's very bureaucratic. It's an institution from the 1950s. We're preparing students to graduate in the year 1955, and so it's not a place that is good for innovators. It's not a place where you can go to try out brand new ideas. It's very conservative, very stick in the mud. It puts a heavy emphasis on conformity, and so I'm not sure that college is the right place for a budding entrepreneur. I mean, maybe if you're in some really technical discipline like data science, you probably need to know a whole lot of information about data science, and there going to college will give you that information. So it's a bunch of technical stuff that you really need to learn. But I don't think it will teach you how to be an entrepreneur. It will teach you how to follow a bunch of rules very carefully.
Interesting. No, I think that's definitely a valid point. So one thing that I, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, think about when I hire someone is how much emphasis do I give to his or her academic backgrounds, right? So definitely that is fading away. So that's a very valid point, that how much I used to care about, hey, whether I need a PhD or master's or bachelor's. I rather now want the ingredients of so from your vantage point, what are the ingredients of employability that you are seeing that I should, like, on a very macro level? What are some of the ingredients of employability that I as a professional should worry about as I'm heading into this chaos?
Well, let's see. Can I answer that question? You want the kinds of things that colleges kind of provides for people. You want somebody who can finish something. You want
Mm-hmm.
somebody who can deal with boredom, because an awful lot of the real world is being bored.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you want somebody who has a reasonably high IQ, and you want somebody who can work with your customers. I mean, you want your customers to be happy, whoever they are. So you want somebody who cares about your customers and has some experience with your customers. And you want somebody who's trustworthy. So those are the things you want, and college sort of guarantees some of those things. But I think a lot of it is just, interpersonal relationships. You have to sort of, judge that human being as they come through come along.
Interesting. And how do you see what do you see as the role of automation or something called AI or machine learning when I venture into the workforce? Like, what do you see the humans and machine collaboration? What are some of your thoughts
Okay.
there?
So, 20 years ago, nobody, I think 20 years goes long enough, nobody foresaw that cars would drive themselves. I mean, I remember they had some competition. They tried to have the cars, they were sitting there looking for the rocks and all that sort of stuff and try to navigate. And of course, it was a complete failure. So what's changed is, of course, you have really good GPS, and you have a cloud where the intelligence of all the cars in the world can be put into one place, and they all know everything every other car knows, and they can now communicate with each other very quickly and very easily. And you can use AI so that you teach them all a whole bunch of stuff from zillions of data points. So cars could do that because they depend really only on one sense, namely vision. You don't need a sense of smell. You don't need a sense of taste. You don't really need a sense of hearing. You don't need a sense of touch. So it depends only on one sense, that is vision. And driving is a bunch of very well-defined rules. It's complicated rules, but nevertheless, don't bump into anything and stay on the road. And, stop at stop signs and stuff like that. So automated driving is something that can be automated. Now, take the other example I've used, and that is the chef. Okay, so a skilled chef needs to use not only vision, but also smell and taste and touch, and maybe also even hearing. So that's 4 senses at least that would need to be combined. Plus, the chef has to have some empathy for the person who's actually going to eat the food, has to know what tastes good and what doesn't taste good. In other words, has to be able to experience good food, him or herself, right? That job's never going to be automated, at least not in our lifetime. So a job which requires multiple senses and requires some human empathy or human understanding of what the result is, those jobs are not going to be automated. So the pathologist, for example, looks through a microscope all day and tries to find cancer cells. Well, a machine can do that. And that job, I think, I'm not a doctor, so maybe I don't know, but I think that job is going to be automated out of existence. I don't see why you would want a human being to be as your pathologist. A computer can do that better than a human can. And it depends only on one sense, namely vision. On the other hand, the general practitioner or the family practice doctor is going to have to talk to the patient, is going to have to look at the patient, is going to have to touch and feel, is going to have to listen to the stethoscope or in other ways. It's going to require multiple senses, and it's going to have to require some human empathy between the human being and the doctor. I don't see how that ever gets automated. So I think that job is absolutely safe. It's going to change in the way it's done. There's going to be a lot more machines involved, and medicine now becomes much more capital intensive and all that sort of stuff. But you're still going to have that person who is a general practitioner. So I think a lot of these specialist fields that depend on one sense, namely vision or touch or smell, but only one at a time, those can be automated. But those that depend on multiple senses, and especially those that depend on some kind of empathy with a human being that have to that have to understand the customer in some personal kind of way. I think those jobs are not going to be automated. And uh, so my son's job, he's in IT security. That job could very well be automated. And he and I have had some conversations. Well, what's going to happen to your job 20 years from now? And by the way, son, you'd better be saving for your retirement, because you may end up retiring earlier than you think you will, than you think you might be. So on the other hand, there are always going to be threats to the cyber threats. And as long as he keeps his skills sharp, he's going to be able, he'll probably have a job, but he's going to have to be on top of it. He's never going to be able to relax and say, well, I know what I need to know. Because he's going to have to work at it. My daughter, on the other hand, will always have a job, because she's in one of those human kinds of things.
Interesting. And so now let's talk about some takeaways from this conversation. So if I'm a parent, what do you suggest? What do you recommend that I should do to keep myself besides reading this book?
Yeah, read the book. I think that's the first thing. But if you're a parent and you have a high school senior who's thinking about going to college, you have to put on your very honest thinking cap. So first of all, is your son and daughter actually going to graduate? That's really important. If your son and daughter is not going to graduate from college, they shouldn't go. So do they have the work ethic? Are they going to be able to deal with the bureaucracy? I'm assuming they have the IQ. That's probably it's important, but it might be one of the less important things in going to college. It's mainly work ethic and ability to conform and ability to follow directions and ability to deal with boredom. An awful lot of college, like a lot of life, is just boring. And your son or daughter needs to have those skills in order to be successful at college. And if it seems like your son or daughter is not going to graduate, then ignore all the advice, they have to go to college to get a job, because that is just nonsense. So if they're not going to graduate, they should definitely not go to college. They should do something else. And any kind of employment would be better than going to college. So they need to be successful at what they do. They need to be good at what they do. They need to somewhat enjoy what they do. And you can build a career starting from almost anywhere. You find out over time what you're good at, what you're successful at, what your talent is, and you go from there. And if you start early enough, it's a lot easier. But some people, as you mentioned, have, they're sort of like developers, and I was one of those. I didn't know that I was interested in chemistry. So then it takes a little bit of time to figure that out. But what you want to avoid is failing at something in a way that puts a stamp on your reputation that says, wow, you fail, and that is sort of a sum of your personality. I'll just ask you the same question. Given a choice between somebody who's really enthusiastic and smart and who never went to college versus somebody who flunked out of college after 3 years, who are you more inclined to hire? So,
fair point. Yeah. So what about an individual? So if I'm I'm that high school guy or gal looking into this future horizon, how should I, what do you suggest? How should I sort of evaluate the situation?
So I think for high school students and people of that age, one of the really important things is stay out of debt and save money. And I know that seems really hard to say because people go into debt to go to college, and maybe in a few cases it's justified, but not very often, I don't think. So let's say you decide you don't want to go to college and you don't have too many options open to you. So you get a job working at a fast food place. So you live at home, so you don't really have that many expenses. And if you can save, $50 or $100 a month or a week, that begins to add up. And then you have no debt, and ultimately, the dollar you save at age 18 is the most valuable dollar you'll ever save, because with compound interest and everything, by the time you're 60 or 65, it's worth a fair amount of money. It's going to be worth like at 5% real rate of return. It's going to be worth, like 8 times what it's worth now. So staying out of debt and saving, getting into the habit of saving money. I think that's a really important thing. And then look around and find out what you're good at, and that is the way you should develop your career. So people are typically good at hobbies. So if you're good at a hobby, find a way that you can work doing something associated with your hobby that you're good at, and find a way to turn that into a career. And you need to be good at what you do. That's really the most important thing. So find something that you're good at what you do, and then do that thing and do it really well, and you'll be fine.
Beautiful. So that brought us to the last part of the conversation. So let's spend some time on your journey. So I think if we say, what are some of the tenets of, or what are some of the qualities that you really hold very dear to as you successfully um, evolved, so as to say?
Well, let's see. What are qualities? So, well, I don't know. Can I think of something like that? I haven't thought about it quite that way. But I've had a reasonably good career, and I've enjoyed parts of it, and I've gotten a little bit more cynical in my old age about what I've been doing. I've tended to like my students, and I've enjoyed the intellectual life and sort of the freedom of doing what I want to do. But would I do it over again exactly the same way? No. If I had to do over again, I'd do some things different. But and I am very respectful of people like yourself who are entrepreneurs. I unfortunately have not had that talent, so that's something I would have liked to have done, but I simply don't have the personality for it. So, and I've obviously been good enough of what I do that I've been able to stay employed for all these years. Well, as I say, I'm retired, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. So yeah, that's basically all I can say about that. I don't think I answered your question, but it's the best I can do.
No, I think that helps. So now let's, one other thing we ask all of our guests is about their favorite reads or any books that they have read, because I think we're talking about, it really helps us understand the gravity and sort of the depth of your sort of intellectual side. So do you have anything that you could share to our listeners?
So a book I read recently, I've read a couple of books recently. I'll just point out two of them. One is by, these are all academic books. So one is by Robert Gordon, and it's called let's see if I can get the name right, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. So it asks a question about why American economic growth has fallen off since the 1970s. And I found that a really interesting book. And even if you don't subscribe to his thesis, he's got so much information in there about how the world works that I found it just a really useful and interesting book to read. And the other book I read not too long ago was by David Hackett Fisher. It's called Albion Seed, and it's about the first pre-colonial or colonial immigration from England to the United States. And that's a book that's a chore, but it's really worthwhile, and I understand much more about my country than I used to understand about it, and it's kind of changed the way I think about things. So those are two books that I've read recently that I would say have had a big influence on me.
Beautiful. So last but not the least, so if you want our listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, what would that be? So what would be your closing remark?
So I think the main thing to take away from it is to first of all, be true to yourself. You have to be good at what you do, which means you have to really enjoy it and understand it. And then don't get into the rut where you think you have to go to college because you can't get a career without going to college. That's not true. If you're good at school and if you're good at college, then by all means go to college. But if you're not good at it, then don't waste your time and don't waste your money. And then be aware of the world changing around you. The things that are going to be automated, in my opinion, are pretty obvious. They're routine jobs, and they're things like mathematics and things like an awful lot of STEM careers. I don't know enough about what engineers do every day, but I have a feeling an awful lot of that's going to get automated, and maybe already is. And some of these jobs won't disappear; they'll just change in a way that makes them unrecognizable from what they're doing today. So keep aware of what technology is happening around you, and then be aware of who your customers are. Who are the people who are going to buy your product? And as long as you sort of keep the customer in mind, you'll be a lot better off. If you get too involved in what it is you're doing and you forget about the customer, then at that point you maybe end up being in trouble.
Interesting.
And then finally, save money. Don't go into debt, and save for retirement, because you're much more likely to retire than you are to finish college.
Interesting. With that, thank you so much, Dan, and to our listeners and viewers, do check his book out. I will put the link on the description. Your Future Jobs: Building a Career in a New Normal, and I think it's an exceptional read for if you want to understand what's happening in the industry. So I would urge you to check out and leave a comment if you like the book and what do you think about the book. With that, Dan, thank you so much for spending a good enough time with us and explaining with listeners and viewers some of the shift that's happening and how they can save themselves from this new normal. I do appreciate your time, and you're always welcome back on the podcast. By the way, is there any sequel to this book as well you're planning?
No, nothing in the works right now. Sorry.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Beautiful.
Take care.
So
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a